Pascal, a very good morning. Welcome there in Ghent, and thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing very fine, thanks, Peter. I'm going to start by talking about the agenda. I want to welcome everyone in this webinar, and the agenda is very simple. There's only 3 topics. The first one is a question, which is about China's innovation and did China's innovation save the world? The other one, and the second question, will be about should we trust China, yes or no? And then I will end with some learnings in general. So
Great.
I'll get started, and I'll start with the very first question, which is really about did China's innovation save the world? Now, that is a big question to ask, but we have to go back to 2015 to really understand what happened. In 2015, Xi Jinping, the president of the People's Republic of China, said very, very clearly that by 2030, China would become the leader in innovation globally. And when Chinese say they want to be the leader, it means they want to be the #1 in the world. Now, he's also said that in 2020, that is this year, he wants China to be one of the most innovative countries around. And so the question is, did he achieve that? Did China achieve that? Now, China is not innovating because they think it's cool to innovate, just like many people in Silicon Valley, for example, feel innovation is really the thing they should do. China's innovating because of the many problems the country has. And these problems are at an enormous scale. I mean, problems like pollution, I don't need to talk about it, but also energy needs that have increased incredibly, security issues with cameras everywhere because cities are cities of 20, 30 million people sometimes, overpopulation, there's an aging population, there's also medical challenges, and we've all learned about that in the past months with the COVID-19 crisis. There's the gap between rich and poor. There's food quality issues, which most people never knew about until this virus came out and suddenly is the talk of the day, of course. And then there's things like mobility, there's unemployment, there's education, there's millions of problems. But the big issue is that any of these problems that China has is as its scale 10, 100, 1,000 times bigger than most of the scales we have in the countries outside China. And that is something that we need to understand. And China has figured out that using people, and they have lots of people, is not going to help that solve these problems anymore. They have to go for innovation, they have to go for technology. And that is where China 5 years ago really made a big change. Now, if we look at the technologies that they're really focused on over the past 5 years, what we see is that there's 9 big innovations and technologies that China within 5 years' time has actually taken leadership in the world. And some of them are really already 1 or 2 years ahead, some even 3 years ahead of the West. And that was all done in the last 5 years. So China's taking that leadership in technology and innovation since a number of years. And these technologies, all of these were used during the Corona crisis to actually make sure that it was contained, make sure that everything went as good as possible. Now, we can't go over all these technologies. It would take me 2-3 hours to go over all the things that China has used during the coronavirus outbreak. So I'm only going to focus on one, just to give you an example of how China is using technology to make a difference. And that will be the topic of artificial intelligence. Now, when we talk about AI, this is really China wanting to become the smartest society in the world. And very early on in 2017 already, China had set the next generation AI plan as a government strategy. It means that 2.5 years ago, or almost 3 years ago, China was one of the first countries to have a government strategy for AI. And at that point, everything changed, and every company in China wanted to become an AI company. And so a lot of other companies before were already doing AI, but that is the moment where everything pivoted. And so this is only 2.5 years ago. So how is it possible that a country like China in 2.5 years ago just took leadership in that area? And if we look back in 2017, the difference between US and Chinese companies when it comes to the applications of AI, and this is a graph about the investments of the VC funded companies in AI, what we see is that American companies in blue were much more focused on making these moonshot innovations. It's long-term innovations. It's things like NLP, machine learning, things like technology platforms, microchips, and so on, things that would be breakthrough so we could go to the next level of AI. China, on the other hand, was much more focused on the pragmatic and being able to use these technologies into society and make money from it instantly. Computer vision, face recognition, don't need to talk about that, of course. Robots, intelligent robots, self-driving cars, drones, speech recognition, all these applications is what China truly focused on since 2017. Now, the real question here is, why did China in just 2-3 years' time took such a lead, such an advantage? And I think it's three things. The first thing is that what the government does extremely well when they want to disrupt a market and make sure they become a leader in some kind of strategy is to build a huge infrastructure. They did it with the high-speed trains, but they're also doing it with 5G. And when it comes to AI, they very clearly put lots of incubators in there in the whole country. They were constantly investing in getting the experts from the world back to China, making it easy for people to develop AI applications, and universities were teaching AI. The whole infrastructure was there very quickly. Secondly, the government, but also the companies in itself, are being put in competition, and every VC is saying, like, you all need to compete to be the first on the market. What that means is that hundreds of companies got into the business, took it serious, and built the best products they could in no time to release on the market, and then have users use these products. And that, I think, is the biggest advantage of China, or difference of China, is the user adoption of new technologies is often much faster in China than in the rest of the world, because Chinese have seen that technology has helped them so far to improve their lives, but also the government and the companies are making it very easy for users to adopt these technologies. And because of that, these three things together makes that in a couple of years, actually China can change completely when it comes to a landscape with a new technology.
Okay, Pascal. Last week we had Ed Sander with us. We shared a couple of examples on the usage of artificial intelligence. If I'm not mistaken, you also have some examples for us. Could you maybe run us through some of the ones that you would like to share with the audience? And then afterwards, we have the first questions coming in from the audience. So I'd like to address a couple of questions in the meantime too.
Sure, no problem. I think there's a lot of examples, and Ed gave some examples already last week. I'm going to go focus primarily on everything related to artificial intelligence. And this is just a subset, but this is the things that I saw and noticed that really changed everything. The first thing is to detect the gene, so gene detection. And so basically DNA research, and also to help research the vaccine and find cures for the coronavirus is something that was using artificial intelligence. The cloud computing was being used everywhere from Alibaba and Tencent on a big scale to quickly find a detection, or detect actually how this virus was looking like and how to find a cure and a solution for it. Second thing is that you could see all the hospitals everywhere in China already using for many, many years AI diagnosis. And these were tools for doctors to figure out, for example, for lung cancer, based on x-rays, if people had lung cancer. Now they've been used, of course, for coronavirus symptoms and infections they could find on the x-rays. Instantly, but handheld, but also all the doctors were already using these technologies before. And these are all Chinese technologies. They're not imported technologies. The other thing is to identify, track, and forecast all the outbreaks. Really make statistics, make prognosis, and predict how the outbreak would actually go through which curve and everything. And today it's even being used with satellite images to figure out if the economy is coming back, rebounding, if there's a recovery, how fast it is recovering, and all that. All that is using AI algorithms developed in China. Now, I think one of the most impressive things over the whole China is the way that they monitored the people that would potentially not comply to the regulation of China to stay inside and would have a too high temperature, a fever, and would be outside. So not just cameras with surveillance, which we all know the story about, but basically cameras with heat detection used by drones, used at every entrance in every mall, in every place that people would go, but also the handhelds to make sure that people in airplanes and on smaller places were actually not having a too high temperature. And even the police were wearing helmets these days with heat detection. So all this on a massive scale to see if there's anybody not complying with the regulations.
Pascal, I'm going to drop in for a second. I have a question on privacy. I'd like then to address two questions of the audience. Without wanting to open the box of Pandora on privacy, there's clearly a very different approach between China and the West in general on privacy. Now, can you maybe share your thoughts on the different approaches between East and West?
Well, I think I could write another book on privacy, so I think we're going to keep it very short, but there's a number of things. First of all, if you live in an environment with millions and millions of people around you, then privacy is often more a luxury than actually something that you are entitled to. So people are not used to the same privacy because of the sheer amount of people. So that's one thing. The other thing, and I think Ed mentioned that already in his webinar last week, is that the regulation on privacy and making sure that there's no breaches usually sits with the government. And the companies that develop the applications that actually have the data, they have to be regulated by the government, which means if they do a breach, then they will be fined or they might lose even their business license from the government to continue to operate. And so the question is really, do the companies trust the government more than do the people trust the government more than do the people trust the companies behind those who use and get all that data. And I think Ed said it last week as well, that in China, in general, people trust the government more than we trust our governments here. And so that's one of the things, but it's much broadly than that, but I don't think we have a lot of time to go into much detail.
Okay, I'm going to just address two more questions. One is from Simone. She's asking us, so who's making these algorithms? Are the big giants like Tencent, Alibaba, Huawei helping technology, algorithms, and AI, or is it someone else? Maybe a very quick question on that one.
Well, I think algorithms in AI, in general, a lot of them are open source already. America open sourced many of them. So most companies, even startups, can start from something. They don't have to start from scratch. But indeed, the bigger companies like Alibaba, Tencent, JD, Meituan, all these big companies are actually developing their own algorithms. TikTok and Toutiao being one of the biggest ones. And they have thousands and thousands of AI experts working on improving these algorithms. So yes, they are Chinese, but the origin might have come from America.
Okay, and then a question on the infrastructure from Benjamin. Has China rolled out the digital infrastructure across the country, or did it keep it for the cities or the main cities?
Well, I think the digital infrastructure, when you look at the mobile penetration in China, it's over the whole country. Of course, there's always still areas where there's not so big, so much penetration as other places, but it's basically 95% of the country is digital right now. And I think there's 850 million users of cell phones, smartphones. So yes, China is a digital country. It's a mobile-only, mobile-first country. That's clear. It's everywhere.
Okay, good. I suggest, Pascal, you share a couple of examples on the application of AI in the meantime. And along the way, we'll try to address some of the questions coming in.
Sure. Well, one of the other things that I think has really made a difference and probably has saved a lot of people's lives and made sure that the outbreak didn't go faster is that people had to stay at home inside. They had to be quarantined. And that means you need delivery, you need e-commerce, you need ways to get these groceries and all the products to the people. And that is where a company like Meituan here on the left, the guy on the scooter with 600,000 employees were actually helping to deliver all these goods to the people locked up. But the reality is that what we don't know always is that this company has the best AI dispatching system in the world. If you look at JD, they had one of the best places to actually have the packages being delivered and being sorted. And so this is all AI being built, but also self-driving cars or robots in the hospitals to bring medicine, to bring medical equipment to the doctors is being something that was deployed in many hospitals in China. So that was instantly a way for people to actually stay inside and not have to go outside like we still have to do very often in the West. Now, on the application side, and I think Ed talked about many applications last week, so I'm not going to repeat a lot of that, but AI applications, especially in healthcare, for self-diagnosis, for consultation, for getting insights on information, to get different QR codes, but also to figure out if claims on people who are being tested positive on COVID-19 is actually a real claim or not. All this was being using AI, artificial intelligence, even blockchain at some stage to actually make sure that this all made sense. And this on an enormous scale. China is the most digital country in the world, and this has saved China a lot at that time. Another thing is education. Ed talked about that also a little bit last week. And this is really about students staying at home and teachers starting to video stream their applications. It was very important that these applications could be rolled out quickly, but also collaboration tools. Today, I mean, these days, Tencent has a Zoom application, just like we're using right now. Tencent has their own application. The United Nations have decided to use the Tencent applications globally now. And so all this was being deployed, and AI was being used already in e-learning very early on, because that is very useful for personal education, personal improvement of your learning skills with artificial intelligence. And these are just some examples, but all this helped people to stay at home, stay safe, and if people didn't follow the regulation, to make sure that the system could find it all out. Now,
Pascal, maybe before we go to the wrap up of this first part, we got a question from Thierry, which I think is a quite interesting one. So he's asking you, how much was China capitalizing on experience and technology from previous outbreaks? Can you comment on the delta you've seen between SARS and COVID-19?
If you allow me, I will answer that question in my second part of the presentation, because I will talk a little bit about that at that point. So I don't want to repeat myself right now, if that's okay.
That's good. That's fine.
So I think I'll just wrap up and say that if you look at the next generation or new generation AI development plan that China had almost 3 years ago, in July 2017, what you could clearly see is that in 2.5 years from now, China reached its goal of 2020, even exceeded that goal, because it's not just that China is competitive in AI anymore. It was very clear from the last 3 months of Corona crisis containment that they were actually had breakthroughs that they did that was used and applied in many industries that could be used instantly during the crisis to save China, and by 2030 or probably before become a leader in artificial intelligence globally. So my view is, to answer my own question maybe from the beginning, is that China did, with China's innovation, really saved China. And that made a huge difference for the outbreak, a huge difference in the way that China managed this whole crisis.
Okay, so Pascal, China has been clearly very fast in the implementation of its AI strategy. And I think a relevant question from Katrien coming in is, does the overregulation in Europe is slowing us down in terms of AI regulation? Well, what's your take on this?
I think the answer is probably yes, meaning that we tend to first regulate and then start business. In China, they tend to just first get everything going, and then when they see that something gets out of hand, then they quickly try to put regulation in there, and they have the power to change things very fast. So it's not that they don't regulate, but they regulate as things change. We regulate often before we change behavior, and that is an advantage of course, a one regime country and governments that can do that very quickly.
Okay, I think it's a beautiful bridge to the second part you'd like to address with us. Eventually, should we trust China? And we have a couple of questions coming in from the audience that we'd like to then address along the way. So Pascal, word back to you. Second part, should we trust China?
Sure, and I think coming back for the first part, I mean, the question is, did China save the world is probably a big question, and it definitely gave the world more time. And so I think the innovation gave the world probably a month more time to prepare. But at the same time, if we look at what happened, I mean, the Corona crisis outbreak started in China. And so it could maybe have been prevented if they would have taken things differently at the early stages of this. And so the real question that has been asked in this context is, do we trust China? When we look at the coronavirus, basically, and what's happening now, it's a pandemic. We look at it in the West as a black swan event. It means a black swan is basically an event that comes up to us that we didn't see likely to happen. And if we just look at the virus outbreaks or epidemics or pandemics of the last 100 years, there's only like four or five that are really made such a big impact on the global population. And that the biggest one was 100 years ago. So we didn't really expect it. But for China, this was not a black swan. For China, it was really a white swan. It means it's something, and that's to answer Thierry's question, it was something that China had experienced many, many times. It did indeed start even before 2003, but definitely in 2003, when the SARS broke out in China, it was something that China had to deal with. And not only China, a lot of countries around China, Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, they all had to deal with SARS. And so after 2003, every country in Asia had basically prepared themselves for new outbreaks later on. And they had the bird flu in China. They had many new viruses coming out. Actually, every year, China has to deal with some outbreaks of viruses. And so this is a real problem. But they are kind of used to it, and they believe themselves that they're very well prepared to do that. Now, if you look at the SARS outbreak and you compare that with the coronavirus outbreak on the graph on the right, what you see is that the SARS, despite the fact that the mortality rate was much higher, actually the outbreak was much slower. And that means that China, even though they were prepared for SARS, were still caught off guard when they saw the coronavirus come in, and basically didn't expect this virus to break out as quickly as possible. Now, this said, reality is they should have known that this could have happened at any time. And that's the blame often the West is giving to China right now. Now, important is to look at the timeline, because we can talk a lot about China, what they did and what they didn't do. But if we look at the timeline, we understand what happened really in the month of January and the week before that. On the 23rd of December, Li Wenliang, the doctor that was called the whistleblower afterwards, was telling the world about this outbreak, or let's say a long disease that wasn't very regular and was a danger, and we should look at it. And he was telling his colleagues, we should take this serious. And reality is, for a whole week, the guy got silenced, meaning censored, and couldn't speak his mind and couldn't tell the people. The government, local government, police was worried that this was just creating chaos and creating panic for nothing. After the facts, in hindsight, of course, we all know that this was one of the biggest mistakes that China made at the very early days of the outbreak. And so this week has been, I think, the biggest challenge that China has dealt with afterwards, and the world has to deal with also. The censorship system, which is intended in China primarily to make sure that people do not create chaos, that there's no chaos in the country and there's no disruption in the country, actually worked completely against them. A week later, on the 31st of December, China announced to WHO, the World Health Organization, that there is a virus in the country and that they don't really know what it is and something needs to be done with it. And they were looking together with WHO how to solve it. One day later, on the 1st of January, They closed the markets in Wuhan because they assumed that the outbreak came from these wet markets in Wuhan. And then 7 days later, China finally was finding out that this was a coronavirus. They told WHO it's not MERS, it's not SARS, it's not bird flu, it's not swine flu, and they figured out within 7 days after they announced to WHO that it is actually an outbreak of corona. 5 days later, on the 12th of January, they actually were able to detect the gene and provide the sequencing or the gene sequencing model of the virus and give that to the whole world, which means that on January 12th, every scientist in the whole world could start researching for a vaccine and to find ways to solve this, the symptoms that the virus has created. So this is kind of the timeline we have between the 23rd of December and the 12th of January. At that point, on the 12th of January, that's when the first people started to be recorded. So 10, 11, 12 were the first people that actually tested positive for coronavirus, because that was the moment that we knew what the virus was about. Before that, it was all guessing and trying to figure it out. And as you can see, it took another week before they were really able to test the population in general, meaning that they could do these tests in an organized way. And then on the 18th of January, suddenly it started peaking like it did in every other country in the world in the same way. And by January 21st, what we had is that there was more than 100 new cases every single day. 2 days later, China decided to lock down Wuhan. That's 11 million people put in lockdown, not being able to leave their apartment. And then 1 day later, 15 more cities in China were in lockdown, and most of the country was actually in self-quarantine. So this took about 12 days from the moment they knew it was a virus and what virus it was, up to the day to put the country pretty much in lockdown. The problem, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry to ask you, but I've got a question from Bart coming in, and it's about, well, there's quite some debate the last days, especially going on about the official reported Chinese infection and mortality numbers. So now that we have a better view on the statistics in the West, people are doubting that they're correct. What's your take on this? Can we trust the numbers? Can we trust the data?
Well, the interesting part of that question, and I thank Bart for asking that question, is basically that before the numbers in Europe and in America were higher than the numbers in China, nobody asked that question. Everybody assumed, just like WHO also said, that the numbers are actually correct, or they believe the numbers. And since our numbers are bigger, then suddenly the question is, do the Chinese numbers, are they real, or are they fake, or are they basically, is it a cover-up? That's the whole question. And I believe we have to look at the way that the West and China is dealing with this crisis. And I think that tells us a lot about whether our numbers could be actually bigger than the Chinese numbers, not because China is faking the numbers, but mainly because the measures we are taking are not as severe as the ones China is taking. So nobody can give you the answer on whether the numbers are real or not real, but I do not see a big difference between our numbers and their numbers in the way that the measures we're taking to control and contain the virus. So it's a big debate, and I think it's going to go on for a long time. But I think we have to go back and understand what the difference is between China and the West when it comes to managing this crisis. And if I can go back just a little bit on what happened in those 10 days that I'm still having on the screen here, is that the problem with those 10 days or 11, 12 days is that this is the busiest travel period in the year. There's only 2 times before and after Chinese New Year that hundreds of millions of people travel throughout the country. 6 million people left Wuhan during those 10 days. And that is the real issue. So the big mistake that China made, in a way, was actually not to put Wuhan in lockdown 10 days earlier or 5 days earlier before people started traveling, because that meant that this virus was starting to break out everywhere throughout the country. And that was the big challenge. Now the question is, did China really make a mistake? Or let's put it differently, was China slow in making that decision and waited those 12 days, which were so critical because they knew everybody was traveling? And to answer that question, we have to look at the response time that we had in the West. And if you look at this graph, what you see is that this is the time every country in the West, and I haven't put all of them on there, but many of the most infected countries and places, the time it took between the first local infected COVID-19 patient and the time that the government was putting actually measures of self-quarantine or lockdown of the whole country. As you can see, despite the fact that China should have done it much earlier, there's very few countries in the West that probably would have taken action faster than China did. And that is just because two reasons. One is just like many of us still don't trust what's happening in China. So we distrust China. And so we didn't want to learn from China to do the same measures as China did. And the other one is we trusted our system much better than we actually should have into this crisis.
Pascal, I have a very interesting question from Simon coming in, who is asking the inverse question. Does China trust other countries?
Well, I think the answer is very simple. I think China has been learning for 30 years from the West. And that means that's how they got so good in AI and 5G and everything. They've been learning from us. And you can't learn from someone without trusting someone. You have to believe that somebody is doing something good, otherwise you won't learn from them. And so I believe China has always had more trust in us because they were interested in being like we are than we had actually trust in China. And I think that distrust is becoming bigger and bigger, also a little bit because of the geopolitical game today between America and China. So my answer is, I do think so far, I'm careful in answering the question, so far, China has trusted the West more than we have trusted China. So if you look at these numbers, what happened is basically on the 4th of February, on the graph here on the left, is what you see is that China had reached its peak of the coronavirus. And that is more than 1 month before the West started taking serious actions and measures to put people in self-quarantine in their country. And the whole month of February, what the world did, what Europe did, what America did, was primarily bashing China and telling China and explaining to everyone that this would be the biggest test that the government and the authoritarian regime in China would have to deal with. We were almost convinced that this outbreak of the coronavirus would actually be maybe the the change of the regime and from the inside of the country, the power of Xi Jinping and the power of the government would actually be affected. And we were convinced that China did so many wrong things in that month of January. And the media was full of it. We were talking about that this regime was really putting people in lockdown. They couldn't leave their houses. It was terrible. It wasn't humane. It wasn't human. People were exhausted in the hospitals. Doctors were working crazy hours. A lot of doctors and nurses got infected. It was not really something that you could do. It was also tracking everyone to make sure people stayed inside with drones, with cell phone, with digital equipment, with cameras, everything. Even companies were forced to build medical equipment for the hospitals. Prisoners were forced to make masks for the hospitals. All of these things in the month of January, every media was talking about that this is typical of an authoritarian dictatorship that can decide what to do with the government, what to do with the people, what to do with the population, and that this is against human rights. The most frightening in that story to me is that almost everything that China did, we copied later on. And we are a democracy. And so the question is really, why did we spend all our time in February trying to say that the regime is guilty of all that and then doing the exact same thing ourselves? And I think the answer is in the fact that a virus has to be treated as a virus.
Okay, Pascal, I want to be mindful of the time. We have about 20 minutes to go in this conversation. So I want to make sure that we also handle the third topic. So for this topic, can you guide us through the conclusion of the second part?
So I'll just continue a little bit faster, but the real issue here is that if we look at this graph, and I think that's an important one to see, is that we were convinced that we were more prepared for a pandemic than anybody else. And the problem with that is that we trust so much in our Western way of dealing with things that we cannot believe that we're unprepared. And so this has to do with a little bit overconfidence of our own system, and we should be careful about it. We look at this as a black swan that came up to us, this coronavirus, but actually it's much more a gray rhino. And a gray rhino is typically an event that we see coming towards us. It's charging at full speed towards us, but we don't want to believe it's true. We believe it's something far away, and so we're not sure that this is for real. What we are seeing is a lot of information that we're putting on this country that's China, that is kind of like so distant and so different from ours that it's hard to believe that we would react in any way possible. So it's all about cover-ups that we were talking about human rights, we were talking about a lot of things, because as long as we talk about this, we don't really see this gray rhino coming towards us. We weren't seeing this danger. What we were seeing was a rhino that wasn't really taking serious. We were seeing something blown up, something of China. It's a fantasy land. It's not for real. And this is typically the way that we've been looking at China so far. And I think that's the real issue, because some of these rhinos are very, very real. And they're getting to us much closer. If you look at the companies, and I could call them gray rhinos as well, it's very clear, the high-speed trains, Huawei, things like drones from DJI. I mean, these are gray rhinos that came to our shores long, long time ago, and they pretty much invaded our markets, and we didn't see it coming because we didn't see and notice the detail and don't notice the information, or didn't want to see the information that was coming to us. If you ask Facebook, they don't want you to talk about TikTok. It's very, very clear. Now, we will have many more rhinos coming from the West. It's not all going to be viruses. I think it's going to be mainly companies and innovation coming to our shores. They're going to be on our streets everywhere. And unless we start noticing and somehow trusting the information that comes from China, the problem is that we won't see these rhinos for real. We will see them as fantasy, and they will be in our streets, and we will have to self-quarantine a lot of our companies because it's going to be way too dangerous to be outside. So,
okay. Yeah, Pascal, before we head to the last topic they have on the menu for us, I'd like to address the audience and tell people we have a couple of questions coming in that we will not be able to answer today, but we'll definitely send you the answers per email afterwards. Nonetheless, I'd like to take one of the questions from Eric coming in for you, Pascal, and it's about trust eventually. So to your opinion, what is the intent of China, Russia, and for example, Cuba sending healthcare workers and materials to, for example, Italy? You can assume that COVID-19 is also hitting Russia. So what is behind this? What's your take on this, Pascal?
Well, I think there's a number of things for that. I'm not going to expand too much, but the problem is that we now talk too much about China helping the world as trying to gain soft power. And it's all about, there's an intention behind. And that's again, that distrust that we have in the country. And I understand why we're thinking that way, because we often see China as like a give and take society. But reality is China has evolved. China has become more sophisticated. And if you take Italy as example, the reason that China really is helping Italy, or has helped Italy a lot, has something to do with the fact that in 2008, Italy was the first country to help China with the earthquake in Sichuan, where 80,000 people died. And so this is nothing more than, these are our friends, they helped us, we want to help them. And as long as the trust relation is okay, is balanced, then we should help them. Of course, the soft power is the cherry on the cake, but it's not the cake itself. And I think that's the big difference. So I think we should accept that China has some good intentions in that as well, and not see it only as soft power. Now, I
Great,
think
Pascal.
if we look at the
I just want
learnings,
to
go ahead.
remind you, Pascal, we have 50 minutes to go,
Yeah.
so just want to make sure you're aware of the timing. Please go ahead.
No problem. Well, if we look at the whole crisis, one of the things that we've been doing so far is really look at the government as responsible for handling this crisis. And I do believe that in general, we look at the government when there's something happening in China. We're very critical and criticizing the government. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be critical. I think that's one of the beauties of the Western democracies and what we do is we are very critical of everything we talk about. But what we see is a mask, and behind that mask is a person. And it's not because it's a mask that they want to hide things. And we need to look more and more at the people behind and the context behind what's happening in China. And so the learnings from China are critical to understand why China is doing certain things. And I think we're not looking close enough to what the real people and the real companies and the entrepreneurs trying to make a difference to get a better life. And each of them has families and has ambitions and has a passion and wants to get a better world for them as well. I think being critical is good, but I think we need the context around that. The other thing is that the power of balance is clearly shifting. What it means is that before it was the West basically telling China what to do. Now we have a much more balanced situation where China is the second world economic power. And so Xi Jinping, the first persona, the first president that really stands up against Trump and against big politicians in the West, is something new for us. But we will have to accept that new reality. If we look at GDP growth that is expected for 2020, it's very clearly that China might be the only big country that is still positive in growth on GDP, and all the others are going to lose out. And that means after the crisis, that is going to be the place where growth is going to happen. And China will demand equal treatment from their partners, from countries, from companies, from people. And that will be something that we need to think about. Now, the new China is going to look a little bit different. It's going to look a little bit like it started in 2019. And that's really about opening up their markets. They're going to continue to open up their markets. They opened up telecom, they opened up insurance and finance and a lot of sectors. They're going to keep doing that. It's going to be the most connected place on the planet, especially on 5G and on IoT and all these things. So the best laboratory in the world to build high-tech products. Same time, it's going to be much more controlled. We're talking about a biosecurity state these days. We're talking about much more control by camera. So that's a reality. And it's also going to be much more regulated. China's going to look much more like Europe moving forward. Now, all that cannot happen without increasing the transparency to make people more accountable. And that means they need that data to be open and to be fair. And to answer the question on is the data real or not, China's moving into an environment of more transparency to make people accountable, to make sure that things are treated in the right way. And all of these things, open, controlled, transparent, all things seem paradoxes for us in the West. But if you've lived in China, these things can live together very easily, just like a communist government can actually lead a capitalist country. It's not a paradox in China. Most important for me is that Chinese customers, Chinese companies, Chinese government is becoming way more sophisticated than before. And after the crisis, it's going to be a huge difference in the way we have to deal with the people. People will want a much better life, will want to spend more time on their life and have a better quality of life, better health. And so that means Chinese people and Chinese companies will have different priorities than before. They're also going to become much more proud on their nation and what they achieved and the way that they've handled this crisis, and even praise the government while we believed the opposite would happen. And so I think China is going to become much stronger. And we have to look at a China that's different. Now we don't...
Pascal,
yep.
Can I drop in with a question from Su Yin? So we now experience firsthand that our global supply chain is really showing its limits. So we created a very complex supply chain maze over the last decade. So now it's showing it's very vulnerable. Because once the weakest link is broken, a kind of a domino effect occurs, but more so it seems to become even a geopolitical weapon. So will the West try to become less dependent on China? And also, is it going to stop globalization to an extent?
Yes, very good question. It's actually what I was just going to say, is that we are all looking at maybe not putting all our eggs in the same basket. Most of the companies have put all their eggs in the Chinese basket because it was just very efficient. I think personally, it's going to become very important now to take some eggs of that out of that basket, not because China would not be able to handle another crisis like the coronavirus outbreak, but more because the world indeed is becoming more complex and is becoming less predictable. And so we need to look at which eggs to take out of that basket. I think that every company will have to make that decision. But if it's about the supply chain, then it's very, very clear that China has some benefits, some advantages that no country in the world has. Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, said it very clearly a few years ago, that China is the only place in the world where you can build high quality products at very good cost, low cost still, built at scale. That means upscale and downscale at any time and deliver just in time. And our whole supply chain is built on that because consumers expect that just in time delivery. And that is what China has built. And they've been able to build that because they have put an ecosystem of partners together in the whole China that work together like a puzzle, which is complete. And so you can rely on every part of the puzzle to make sure actually you can get this. And the main reason they achieve this is a huge investments over the past 10, 20 years into this supply chain, investment in factories, in automation, in people, in training, and vocational expertise. And that is something that even if we want to take eggs out of the basket, is going to be very difficult to replicate. And so we have two choices. One is to do it, and then we'll have to choose some of the things that China has an advantage to say, we're going to drop that, and maybe we're going to focus on something else. The other thing, the other way of doing it is basically to do it together with the Chinese and see it as an opportunity, and maybe they will put their factories outside China. Now, the last thing I want to say here is that we all have lost a little bit our direction. And we're all trying to figure out what is going to happen in the future. And I think the best way to look at that is to go back at the compass, which is an original invention from China many, many centuries ago, and to look at what the West did and what the East did. So far, the West has always produced its products and sold them into the East. It means it was a West to China, a West to East strategy. Good qualities were built and designed and innovated here. Now, what we will see after the crisis, and many companies already started before the crisis, is to change their strategy. They changed their strategy in a West for West and an East for East. It means that some companies will decide to move out of China or try to be less dependent on China and have a pure West to West strategy and drop China because it's becoming way too complicated, way too sophisticated. And so they will not focus on that and they'll focus on Western countries. Others have already put in place an East to East strategy. Think of L'Oreal or Starbucks or even Tesla now. They're focusing on being in China for China, and that strategy will play out very well. But they double down on the Chinese growth, which will come there this year. The companies that will, in my view, have the best success over time will those companies, those global companies be that have an East to West strategy. And that will be the fact that they have an East for East strategy for the Chinese market and the Eastern market, but they will be close to the market that is growth, and that is going to be Asia. And they will be close to those consumers that are very sophisticated, very demanding, and they will start building their products and their innovations in the East and then bringing them to the West. And that is the direction that I think the future will be about in this decade, and slowly we'll move into that direction.
Okay, Pascal, would you be able to wrap up the learnings of this this third part in about 2 minutes, so we have a couple of time for a little surprise at the end of this session?
Sure. So just one last conclusion, I would say. What are the learnings that I have seen and that I think we should take away from it? Is that I think we should continue being very critical of China. I'm not saying criticize China, but be very critical and not be naive, and basically look at the facts and trying to challenge those facts to make sure it's right. But let's not do that without putting the context into place and understanding what China's going through, what hardship they've gone through in the coronavirus crisis, for example, and why they're taking certain decisions. I think we're being too critical without having a context, which means we're only using half of our brain, and we shouldn't be doing that. The other thing is that we should start treating China as equal because they will demand it. And if we don't, then we better stay out of China because they will only want to be doing business with people that are equal to them. We should accept that China is becoming much more sophisticated when it comes to consumer behavior and consumer expectation, but also the innovation level and the development of the country. And so we should be prepared for a much more complicated market. And maybe that could be even the best market to try things out and then move it from there to the rest of the world. And ultimately, I think we need to be relevant. We need to look for relevance. If we are in China, do business with China, we have to have a for China strategy. If not, then we might better just stay away from China and try and do it just without China. I think these are the lessons that every country, every company, every entrepreneur will have to learn over the next months and hopefully get a lot of benefit and opportunity from working with China.